Just gone 9:38 in Johannesburg, South Africa this morning. Now, the media often conflates malicious criticism with genuine critique. Why it shouldn't? An article by Professor Julie Reed and questioning the workings of the media profession. Professor Julie Reed is based in the Department of Communication Science at the University of South Africa, UNISA, and specializes in media studies. We welcome her now to the program. Good morning, Prof, and welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on this morning.
All right, so you talk about differentiating criticism from some of the defensiveness that journalists sometimes, express. Uh, is freedom of media an absolute right? Do you think that journalists are beyond criticism?
Absolutely not. I mean, the article that I wrote in the conversation that you are referring to actually comes from an extract from a book that my research partner and I published recently, just examining the mainstream media's representation of marginalized communities in South Africa. And it's no secret that media freedom is under threat. That is a legitimate concern. It's under threat all over the world. We're seeing quite alarming trends in various different countries, including, the increase in jailing of journalists, harassment of journalists, and the assassinations of journalists. So there's no doubt that media freedom is under threat, but under no means is media freedom an absolute right. Freedom of expression, even under the South African Constitution in Chapter 2, does come with its limitations. But the thing that I would like to highlight the most is that we often end up talking about media freedom anytime anyone tries to critique the media. And that usually becomes like a blocking tool in these media freedom debates because, anytime someone tries to critique the media or offer genuine constructive criticism of how the mainstream media behaves, the media proponents often respond by saying, oh, no, but you can't do that because media freedom is under threat and we have to protect media freedom. And my only point is there's a big difference between, a corrupt politician critiquing the media because his motivations are sometimes quite shady, and he's obviously got political interests, and he has certain reasons for trying to critique the media in nefarious ways. But there's a big difference between someone like that with political motivations critiquing the media and someone who has got a genuine concern for the quality of media content, whether you are a media academic like myself or just an ordinary citizen from a grassroots community who wants your story to be heard in a dignified way. And I think it's unhelpful when media workers and editors and so on say that, well, you can't offer this critique because that's an attack on our media freedom. Media freedom is not a sacred cow, and it doesn't mean that the media is untouchable. All professions deserve to be critiqued. And so we're just saying that, these unhelpful debates need to stop because there are many, many different communities and peoples throughout the world who deserve for their voices to be heard through the media content and deserve a media that respectfully represents their interests.
Mhm. Do you think there's anything like an unbiased media? I mean, is that a misnomer that people are made to believe that you'll always what you'll be reading is the unbiased truth, whereas it may actually be that behind every story written there is an agenda, there is a personal bias that comes through in the way it's presented.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a very good question. I think that any media outlet worth its salt is going to try its utmost to practice objectivity and independence. And that is a good thing. And those are good professional standards that, any good journalist is going to strive for. But from an educator's point of view, I can tell you that one of the first things that we teach in Media Studies 101 is exactly what you just mentioned, is that there's really no such thing as a 100% unbiased media. Whether that's driven by agenda, I don't know. It could be driven by simple cultural ideology or political ideology, not necessarily a very particular agenda. But It very much depends on how a media editor or the ethos within a particular media outlet is going to choose to frame certain issues. And there's nothing we can really do about the fact that, the media is still created by human beings, and human beings are naturally biased creatures. But I think that as long as a media outlet can strive for objectivity as much as possible and try to offer balance in a story, then they're heading in the right direction at least. One of my biggest problems with the mainstream media in South Africa in particular is that what we tend to see, and this is something that was highlighted in our research for the book, is that while a media outlet will claim to be objective, and on the surface of things they look as if they are objective, when they're reporting on a story, they really only gain information from the sources of officialdom. So, for example, politicians, high-profile business people, and perhaps a state institution like the police service. What they tend to not do is look for voices of people at grassroots level, ordinary citizens, and on the ground, even though these are the people who may have been first-hand eyewitnesses to events, and the other sources who I mentioned probably weren't even at the scene of the event that is being reported on. So even though it looks as if this is an unbiased publication or broadcaster, when you dig down into it, they are actually practicing bias just in terms of who they choose to source their information from.
Mhm. With the dwindling economies, COVID-19, and the lack of resources that media institutions, I mean, like every other business, are also facing economic challenges. Do you think that that opens the road for, manipulation of the media by those who may have the resources, by government funding, government advertising, and that begins to drive a particular message through a newsroom, or private interests that may be funding a particular institution? Do you think the media is susceptible to that?
I think that the South African media sector is currently really on a knife edge. You're absolutely right. We're seeing that a lot of community media outlets and community newspapers have closed down during the COVID-19 crisis. AIP, the Association for Independent Publishers, has reported that 80 community newspapers closed within the first 90 days, and we know that the situation is not much better in the mainstream media sector. So, yes, I think it is a danger. I think that money talks. I think it still remains to be seen, though, whether or not this is going to be a factor in the South African media. We're still early days in terms of this economic crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. But there definitely is a danger. And I think it's something that we have to guard against. The South African media is in such financial doldrums and in such financial crisis of financial sustainability at the moment that I think it is vulnerable to political actors and corporate sector actors as well, coming in with financial bailouts and so on. The thing that does give me hope, though, is that we do have a very strong core of independent media in South Africa that has proven over the past 10 years to be incredibly robust. And reporting without fear or favor on incredibly difficult stories. So my hope is that those core group of really strong, good media workers and journalists and editors who are still there won't allow their principles to be infringed upon during all of this.
Finally, Professor Julie, coming back to the point about journalists and media being above criticism or viewing themselves as perhaps being above criticism, do you think there will be a maturing in the thinking or a restructuring of what actually constitutes journalism, a redefining of this particular field of economic activity?
I think there has to be. A lot of the data that we've pointed out in the book actually highlights how we believe if the journalism sector could start reporting slightly differently, simply in the nature of its own content, it could actually increase the financial sustainability of the sector overall. So it can have these knock-on effects of broadening audiences, increasing media diversity, having wider appeal, and therefore, obviously, as audience numbers grow, so do the potential to earn revenue. So I'm hoping that people in the media sector will see the value in increasing the number of or the spectrum of voices that are represented in the media. But it's also a long-term project. It's going to mean that everybody in the media ecology really needs to get on board with that. So I'm talking about journalism training that happens in higher education colleges and at universities, journalism education. The regulatory bodies like the Press Council and the BCCSA would need to be on board with that. And then obviously the media sector itself. What we're really trying to put forward here is almost like a decolonized media sector, and one that isn't sort of structured along such traditional Western narratives, Western modes of thinking, but is more appropriate to a South African context and a South African economy. And I think that if the media can come on board with that, it can actually benefit the media in various ways, including in terms of its own financial sustainability. That's my hope, at least. So I hope that positive change will come about.
Professor Julie Reid from the Department of Communications at the University of South Africa. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much for having me on the radio station.